Today is Tuesday, December the 9th, 2014, and I'm Joan Gremont, and the videographer is Lynette Recursion, and we're very happy to be interviewing you, Harold.
I look forward to it, thank you.
Harold, tell us about your early life, where you grew up, and where your parents and perhaps your grandparents came from.
Well, I was born in Rhodesia, formerly known as Rhodesia, but then subsequently became Zimbabwe as such. And my parents emanated from, my mother came from Lithuania, and my father came from Vienna, directly to Africa, and they met in southern Rhodesia at the time, which was predating Rhodesia. And they got married in southern Rhodesia. My father, William Baeck, he was a tobacco farmer and grew tobacco, as well as had a tobacco factory that produced tobacco leaf for export. And my mother was a homemaker. And we lived in a town called Salisbury, which was predominantly black in character. But I went to school in Salisbury, and eventually I went to the University of Cape Town in South Africa for further advanced education. And from there I graduated as an architect in Cape Town, South Africa, and worked for a firm in Cape Town for a short period of time. During that period of time I met Faye, my wife. She was at the University of Cape Town, and she came from Bulawayo, which was the neighbouring city to Salisbury. It was the second largest city in Rhodesia at the time. And we decided to get married. I was offered a partnership in a firm, an architectural firm in Cape Town, South Africa, which I turned down. And I went back to Rhodesia and started my own practice. We started a family in Salisbury, and the family initially was a little boy called Lawrence, and he went to school in Salisbury. 4 years later, Janine came along, and she went to a Jewish school in Salisbury. Lawrence was very successful as a little boy, became head boy of the school, and I continued with my practice, which expanded to become one of the largest architectural practices in southern Africa, south of the equator. I had an office that located in Rhodesia, South Africa, Botswana and Zambia, and I also had offices in London, Paris and The Hague in Holland, which required me to travel a lot in order to ensure that, everything operated well. Excuse me. Unfortunately, the political situation in that part of the world, because Rhodesia became Zimbabwe, we felt very uncomfortable from a political aspect and from a financial aspect. We decided to immigrate to South Africa, where I had the office in Cape Town at that particular time. Unfortunately, from my perspective, my future was very, very assured in terms of my practice and as well as my activities. I was head of the Hebrew congregation as president for a number of terms. We had 600 family members, which was quite substantial. And also I was chairman of various societies and president of the Institute of Architects for several terms. All of that made me a big fish in a small pond, which wasn't really that predominant, but nevertheless it was good for my ego, I guess. But nevertheless, we decided to leave all our assets behind because funds were blocked in Rhodesia or in Zimbabwe. We weren't allowed to take any funds out at all, and they diminished in value over time. We moved to South Africa as a temporary opportunity to try and see whether the opportunity in South Africa afforded us to be able to stay there for the rest of our lives, but we were somewhat concerned about the fact that South Africa was going to go the same way. The practice in Cape Town was flourishing, but I decided to sell it, and there again we were restricted in taking funds out. But we decided to go to Dallas, Texas. This was in 1986, because we felt that there would certainly be a future in the United States. We arrived in Dallas, and Faye had a brother and sister-in-law here, and made us feel very welcome when we arrived at the time, and it was a base for us to start a new life. Since then, the activities have been somewhat curbed insofar as architecture is concerned, because I felt that I wanted to focus more on development, which I believe I've done reasonably successfully. Our children, Janine and Lawrence, went to university. They had a wonderful university education. Lawrence went to Stanford, and he graduated with the top honors there in a field that was somewhat selective. It was an economic speciality, and he then subsequently did a tour of the Far East by his later employer, and eventually found his way back to academia by going to Harvard University, and he did his MBA there. Janine went to Emory, and she specialized in social activities as such. Can you cut it? Ari, can I see you? And as far as Janine was concerned, she went to NYU and did a further qualification over there. She lived in New York for some time, and got married to Ross Monshine. He's a doctor, and she has 2 beautiful children. Lawrence moved to LA, and there he decided to get into the same business as I am in, and that is in real estate development. And he's currently involved with a large group of apartment developers, and he is doing okay. He has 2 children. He's married to Beth Jackson, who are long-time LAians, if there's such a word as such, and they are very happily married. They have 2 children, twins, a boy and a girl, and they live in Baeck Crest. What more can I add? You asked the questions.
All right. Well, thank you, Harold, for all that. You've answered a lot of the questions. Tell me about the Jewish life in Zimbabwe growing up. You said you were head of the shul and there were 600 families.
Yes.
Was it a strong Jewish community?
Well, it was fairly strong. It was an Orthodox community, but we did have Reform, and we had a split Orthodox community. It was Sephardim and Ashkenazim, and the two were distinctly separated because of old rivalry and political aspects as such. Before I left, I got together with the Sephardic head of the community, and we tried to consolidate the 2 communities together. But the old-timers at the time were adamant that they didn't want to do so, and we were unsuccessful. Subsequently, I understand that because there was a diminishing number of Jews left in Zimbabwe, the 2 communities have gathered together, but have not formed a close and strong bond for the same political reasons. The community was very influential. They were represented by judges, and of course physicians and lawyers, and I guess an architect as well by the name of me. But the influence of the Jewish society insofar as the overall community was concerned was fairly profound, but nevertheless we did encounter anti-Semitism. And I can recall on one occasion when I was summoned by the Minister of Internal Affairs, when I was president of the Hebrew congregation, we were told at the time, and this was during Yasser Arafat's reign, that Jews were second-class citizens and Arabs came before Jews as such. And that was the red flag as far as I was concerned, and I summoned a meeting of all congregants and I explained our situation. And that perpetuated the emigration, not solely, but it encouraged people to leave because we felt very uncomfortable because of the political pressures that were exerted on us.
How come your parents went to Rhodesia?
I am a little hazy about this because we never communicated parents to child, and being the only child, I don't know why, but I do understand that as far as my late mother was concerned, her name was Celia, or Tsili, she emigrated from Lithuania to be with her sister who had already arrived in southern Rhodesia in the early 1930s. And they eked out a living in the rural areas. She was married to a Pole. I think the reason why she left Lithuania was the pogroms that occurred in the early 1900s and affected the family. She came from an extremely wealthy family. They owned textile mills and they owned small refineries and merchant houses and so on. So it must have been quite traumatic for her to leave that part of the world being very comfortably off and move into virtually a jungle situation, because she always used to reflect on how her parents were very comfortably off, and he was a very religious man, her father, my great-grandfather. And from my father's point of view, that's quite an interesting story, because at the age of 19, he left Vienna and went to Holland, to Rotterdam, to learn the tobacco industry trade. And after a number of years, they sent him to the Far East, starting off in India, Java, Sumatra, Celebes, and he learned the trade there, and after many years found his way to South Africa, and eventually found his way to southern Rhodesia, where he met my mother and they got married there. And that's as much as I know. My father's background is very vague. I believe that they had a leather or shoe factory in Vienna. That's his parents. But he never talked about it, and it always puzzled me. So that's as much as I can tell you.
And Harold, what was your family's reaction when you decided to emigrate?
We discussed it as a family. I had a very serious dilemma because my mother was still alive. And being the only child, that sort of personified the fact that it was my responsibility to ensure that she was looked after. I actually summoned the chief rabbi of South Africa to discuss my emigration, or our emigration, because it was on my conscience. Do I take her with her? She was ailing, or does she stay behind? And his advice was, I still doubt it, but his advice was, leave your mother behind, which was very hurtful. It was painful. And we decided that under the circumstances, from a rabbinical point of view, according to him, the young family must continue to exist and shouldn't be left behind. So we emigrated, but she used to come to Dallas periodically, and she was in reasonably fair health until it began to deteriorate, but she was well looked after. She had 2 servants permanently in an apartment, and she was fine, and she had a driver as well, and we had real estate which she enjoyed looking after in Salisbury. So that gave her a direction, but of course her child, which was me, and her grandchildren were predominant in her life. So we used to see her periodically here in Dallas.
So she lived out her life in Zimbabwe?
Yes, she did.
Okay.
Yes, she did.
So talk about your journey from South Africa to Dallas, and the reason you came obviously was because you had family here. And what was Dallas like to you, other than your family, as far as welcoming you to the community when you came?
Well, I used to travel on business from Southern Africa to the United States, and I used to stop over in Dallas as well as other centers on business, doing research on, for instance, on factory development, textiles particularly. I did a number of large textile mills in southern Africa and in hospitals, several hospitals. So I used to do a lot of research, and I used to have meetings in various centers, and one of which was Dallas. And at the time, which was in the late 70s, early 80s, Dallas was booming, and they were calling the crane the national bird of Texas at the time, and the crane namely being these high structures that were used to build high-rise buildings. So I felt that there was an objective, as far as I was concerned, to move to a place where the industrial sector, from my perspective as an architect, would be lucrative, in addition to which there was Faye's brother, who had already settled here for a number of years, and hopefully that would have made us more comfortable in our reach for a new life as such. So that was primarily the reason why we came here, and of course to escape the pending doom in southern Africa.
Right. And what Southern African Jewish cultural traditions have you maintained with your family and in your home?
Well, we've digressed somewhat. I used to be quite orthodox in our lifestyle as such. And coming to the States, that's been denuded somewhat to the extent that we've become conservative. Although we did belong to the Chabad of Dallas for a number of years, to which I had designed the building for the Chabad as a donation. And we didn't really become very much involved in Jewish communal affairs, because the objective was really more so to start a new future, because we weren't able to bring much funds to the United States to pursue our goals to that matter. So the foundation was to build a financial base before expanding into other areas.
And do you still have family in Southern Africa?
I have no family whatsoever. Faye has a family, a sister in Zimbabwe, but other than that, no one at all.
So do you travel there, or when were you last in?
We go almost annually to Cape Town. We love Cape Town, and we meet with Faye's sister and my brother-in-law and the boys, and we have a wonderful time in Cape Town. We love it so much that we go on a yearly basis. But I haven't been back to Zimbabwe since 1989. That was the last time I was there in order to unveil my late mother's tombstone. It's my wish to go back to visit my parents one of these days, of course, and we're planning to do so in the next year or two. But I have no interest in going back to Zimbabwe, none at all. In fact, it's a sad occasion because, as I said previously, all our assets were blocked and then eventually taken away from us.
Are you US citizens?
We are US citizens.
And do you consider yourself an American, and how do you feel about being a US citizen?
I feel comfortable that I am a US citizen, but my bond is still in the old country as such. I have a certain allegiance towards that part of the world, despite of what has taken place. But if it were for me to choose between the old country and the United States, the US comes first.
So I presume you're glad you came here?
I'm glad I came. I'm a small fish in a big ocean, and whilst over there I was a big fish in a pond. But that doesn't matter, because the children, provided them with a strong foundation, and that was the purpose. We left for the sake of the children rather than for ourselves. We didn't suffer any indignities or anything like that, fortunately. It was hard to start over again. I'm sure you've heard the story very frequently. But nevertheless, psychologically it was difficult, and financially it wasn't easy. But thank God things have come right, and hopefully we'll pursue the same direction.
Anything I haven't covered that you'd like to add?
Lots and lots, but I can't think of any.
Right now. All right. Well, Harold, we appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
All right, Harold, I just want to ask you a few more questions about your children's education, where they were educated, and were they at Jewish schools or not Jewish schools?
Yes, as young children they were educated at a Jewish school in Zimbabwe, in Salisbury, and it was a very good school. It had high qualifications and standards. When we went to Cape Town, they went to Herzliya in Cape Town and also did very well there. And ultimately, when we came to Dallas, they went to Solomon, let me correct that. Janine went to Solomon Schechter, and Lawrence went to Green Hills School. And then finally, Janine went to J.J. Pierce before she went to university, and then Lawrence went to Stanford from Green Hill, and then ultimately to Harvard University.
And one other thing I want to touch on was the Zionist feeling in Zimbabwe. How did you feel about Israel?
I was brought up in Habonim. I wasn't very much involved, but because we also lived on a farm to a certain extent, so it was difficult to commute. But nevertheless, I was brought up not as a revisionist, because the Beitarim were more revisionist than Habonim. And that was my grounding as far as Israel was concerned. But I've always felt very strongly about Israel and have always supported Israel. In fact, I was in the IUA committee for many years. That's the Israel United Appeal Committee. And I was fervently involved with raising funds for Israel as such. That was a Southern African committee, not just a Southern Rhodesia or Rhodesia or Zimbabwe committee as such. So I've always had an interest in Jewish affairs, and I've always supported Judaism, and in fact fought for Judaism, as the example I gave you with the Zimbabwe government earlier, where Jews were considered to be a second hand or a second type of people. And I fought against that, and of course I fought against anti-Semitism. When I became president of the Institute of Architects, I was invited to join the Salisbury Club. The Salisbury Club was no Jews and no dogs and no blacks were allowed.
Yeah.
But I was invited to become a member, and so at the luncheon I stood up and I said, "Thank you for your invitation, but why do you invite Jews when there are no Jewish members?" And one of the committee members stood up and said, "Mr. Baeck, well, firstly, we want Jews in our membership as such. We do have a member, and his name was Sir Roy Walensky. Now, Sir Roy Walensky happened to be one of the previous presidents of the Southern Rhodesian government, but he wasn't fully Jewish. And they tried to use that as a means to encourage me to join. And I refused to join, and I turned them down. And then I got a second invitation from another one of those clubs in Bulawayo to join, and I turned them down. Because what was the point in acknowledging their anti-Semitism when I fought against it? So that's one of the comments that I can make to you.
Good, thank you. Anything else? Harold, tell us about anything special that you brought with that belonged to your family.
Well, I omitted to tell you that my late father was a stamp collector. He was a well-known stamp collector in Rhodesia and in Southern Africa and also internationally. And he brought the stamp collection from Vienna with him. It started very many years ago in the early 1900s. Mm-hmm. And it was an assembly of stamps, very first stamps from Britain and Europe, and also in, I believe, the eastern part of Europe, insofar as Czechoslovakia and Romania and so on are concerned. But the interesting thing about it, besides the value and the intrinsic value of those stamps, is that in many instances they were unique. To give you two examples, the British collection comprises of the world's very first stamp. And he started collecting the original sheet. Now, it wasn't just the original sheet. They obviously had many, many sheets produced but he tried to assemble the 240 stamps of that particular sheet, which amounted to 240 pennies, which is equivalent to £1. And pretty much of that exists today. I still have it in my possession, and I have been expanding it as well as the other countries as such. But the second point I want to make is that when he was living in southern Rhodesia, he had found an opportunity to make a discovery which is now internationally known. And that is, when you mail insufficient mail, put insufficient stamps on an envelope, you have to pay postage due.
Right.
And a letter came to him with a postage due stamp added to the envelope. But it wasn't a normal one. Why wasn't it normal? It wasn't a printed one, it was a hand-printed one, which was extraordinary, and he noticed this. So he quickly went to the post office and ordered a sheet of them. It was hand-stamped, by hand. Each stamp was different. And he kept quiet about it for about 6 or 7 years, because he didn't want anyone else to know about it. And then when he exposed this sheet of stamps, of course everybody was interested, and of course they were out of issue, because it was out of date. And he tore off, or took off is the better word of explaining it. He took off 3 stamps and sent them to Her Majesty the Queen of England, who is purported to have the best stamp collection in the world. Why did he do that? For publicity. The moment it was announced that she had received those 3 stamps, of course everybody wanted them. So the value of those stamps compounded considerably. And he sold the sheet and kept a number for himself, which I still have today. And an article was written in a famous stamp book and magazines about this discovery. So I thought I might want to add that for posterity.
And Harold, who do you think anybody, your grandchildren or children, are going to want to continue the stamp collection?
Regrettably, that's a good question, Joan. Regrettably, they are not interested at all. It's something that I have had to accept, and I'm slowly selling the collection.
That sculpture over there, do you want to tell us a little bit about it?
Well, that is a sculpture that I brought with me from Zimbabwe. It is a sculpture, and I don't recall the name of the author, but at home we've got soapstone sculptures done by Henry. And Henry is a world-famous sculptor. We've got several of his at home, of which many of his works are located in the Louvre, also at the Guggenheim, and various other museums and galleries throughout the world. And we were lucky enough to have purchased several of his. And I was fortunate enough to know him as an individual. And he signed several examples for me to keep for myself. Obviously, I paid for them, but nevertheless, they have become extremely valuable. Just to give you an idea, some of his work is estimated or have been sold for $30,000. So we've got several of his, but the one that you've just taken is not of his. It's a granite sculpture, and it's called The Lonely Man.